Depending on how you look at Officer Stephen Mader, you could come to three different conclusions about him. He is a white West Virginia cop who refused to fire his gun at a black man who refused to drop his. And Officer Mader was fired. Some say he was sandbagged by a bunch of bad cops who think that Mader make them look bad. Some say that Mader was a cop fired after screwing up too many times. And some are wondering if it's a little bit of both. That no matter how you look at it, Officer Mader responded to a domestic call where a 21-year-old African-American male who was suicidal and had a gun, but he didn't shoot. His colleagues arrived right after him, and they did shoot, and that man died. After Mader was fired, he sued the department and the city. Officer Mader served in the Marines in Afghanistan. He said he didn't feel that man was a threat, and he also felt that man, Ronald Williams, was actually trying to commit something called suicide by cop, where you goad cops into shooting you to death. He told Newsweek why he made his determination.
Disgruntled employee doing a one-sided story, and that's how that all got misplaced. So that his statement contradicts his own tale to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I understand media wants to know now, but that's just not the real world. There's investigations, there's statement, there's people to track down, there's videos, there's lab testing and results that need to be done.
Okay, so obviously I said that that was Stephen Mader who was telling Newsweek why he made the decision not to shoot, and instead you saw his bosses talking about their reasons for firing him. A whole bunch of other reasons, they said. Nothing to do with this shooting necessarily. Well, maybe a little. But here's Stephen Mader and what he said to Newsweek about his decision.
Disgruntled employee doing a one-sided story, and that's how that all got misplaced. So that his statement contradicts his own tale to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I understand media wants to know now, but that's just not the real world. There's investigations, there's statement, there's people to track down, there's videos, there's
Okay. Sometimes there's bugaboos that play behind the scenes in the control room, and you just saw the same soundbite twice, and I am sorry about that. But believe me when I say it, Stephen Mader has a story to tell. He says he made the decision because of his background. He says he made the decision because of what he saw in front of him. Stephen Mader, an officer who responded to an African-American male in front of him waving a gun and saying, "Go ahead and shoot me, go ahead and shoot me now," he decided not to do it. And he says that's the reason he got fired. You know that whole zeitgeist thing right now? Black Lives Matter, police shootings, all controversial. Maybe he didn't want to be the next guy on TV. Or maybe he did do a bunch of really crappy things, and this was just sort of the tip of the iceberg, or at least the last straw. Sean Hamill is a reporter with thepostgazette.com. He joins me from Pittsburgh. I don't know if I have that story right. I feel like I have the story right, but also, Sean, I think there's still a lot of questions that are unanswered. Do you get the impression, covering this story, that he's a good cop? Or do you get an impression that he's a bad cop who needed firing?
Well, he has told consistently since day one, including to the police, his statement, the exact same story. And it's the exact same story he told me when he finally agreed to talk to me about 4 months after the shooting. And, you know, he really was a reluctant public face for this issue. He contacted me about a month after this occurred, and the only reason he contacted me was because he was upset by a story that we did about a press conference where the chief of police in Weirton told me and other reporters that all three officers involved in the shooting were back at work and doing well. It was only hours before that press conference that Stephen Mader had been told that he was fired. And so he was incensed, but he wanted to wait till he got an attorney before he cleared to see if it was okay to talk to me. He didn't come running to me in any way, and I asked him to give him the best thought. And immediately when he finally agreed to, he told the exact same story. And here's why I think your question is important, whether he's a good cop or bad cop. But I think it is such more nuanced because he defends his own actions, but he also simultaneously defends the action of the officer who did shoot Ronald Williams. He, since day one, never thought that the other officer did anything wrong. And he said
so that's interesting. That is
and
really
he said the
interesting.
difference
I
is
think
the
that
other
really
officer didn't
brings
have the
to
same
light.
information as him.
I think that brings to light a very interesting point. It wasn't as though Ronald Williams, 21 years old, suicidal, waving a gun around, shouldn't have been shot. He is saying maybe just not at the moment that I was facing him down. But I do have this fascination with how the police department didn't have his back on this one. I think I actually do have his words now when Stephen Mader spoke with Newsweek. Let me play that.
You know, I would just make contact with them outside and go through the incident like any other domestic, you know, where the party is separated already. So, I mean, that was my initial thought, was just to talk to him and see what was going on.
Talk to him and see what was going on. Sounds like policy I have heard before. Timothy O'Brien is the attorney for Stephen Mader, and he joins me live from Pittsburgh. Thank you so much, Timothy, for being with me this evening. So,
thank you for having me.
I can see where your client's coming from, but I can also see a guy who has lots of accusations against him. I think one of them was made that he didn't report the death of an elderly woman as suspicious. That's one of the things his bosses say. They say a couple of other things as well, like he used a lot of profanity in public and that he was doing illegal searches of cars, etc. Is your client, Officer Mader, milking the moment, milking the media coverage, milking the zeitgeist right now about Black Lives Matter and police shootings and how, wow, I didn't shoot and they fired me for this? Is he taking advantage of the circumstance, the headlines these days?
Not in the least. This is one of the best persons that could be a police officer. Mr. Mader is the type of person that we want as a police officer. This is a young man, he's 26 years old, and in his short life, he served this country in Afghanistan. His mission there as a Marine was to defuse IEDs. He came back after that service and began serving as a police officer to protect and serve, just like he did in Afghanistan. It is shameful for the police department to drag this man's reputation through the mud, and it's outrageous. And
okay,
it's particularly outrageous. Go ahead.
Let me push back a little bit, because what they say, and I want to specifically ask our control room to cue up that soundbite of Travis Blogger, the city manager, where he talks about where the gunfire went into the temporal lobe soundbite, because the police say that what your client, Officer Mader, reported happened at that scene actually wasn't what happened at that scene and caused a whole lot of mess. When the media reported, you know, this guy was shot in the back of the head, doesn't that sound suspicious? It turns out he was not shot in the back of the head.
Officer Mader never said that.
Okay, well, let me play what Travis Blogger, the city manager, asserts. Here he is.
He was shot in the right temporal lobe. When you start running news stories saying that he was shot in the back of the head, you perpetrate an argument amongst people that isn't factually accurate. And to share the facts is he was shot in the right temporal lobe. That was based on the medical examiner's report and a press conference that the county prosecutor had as well.
So, Timothy O'Brien, you're saying he never said that? Because they're saying he had inconsistent stories.
No, Officer Mader never asserted, never stated that Mr. Williams was shot in the back of the head. Officer Mader has never made a single statement that's critical of the conduct of the other police officers. The only thing that Officer Mader has said is this: I made a decision that was consistent with the requirements of the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution, not to use deadly force unless it was required. He made that decision, he made that judgment, he showed some restraint, and instead of being praised for that, he was punished. And
all right,
the conduct of the police department is inexplicable.
Okay, so I want to bring in Darren Porcher, who's a retirement NYPD lieutenant and a criminal justice expert, knows a thing or two about being a cop. What are your views on this? You've seen as much as you have in the media.
Right.
not
I'll tell you,
knowing
I've
them.
investigated a lot of these incidents when I was a lieutenant in the Internal Affairs Bureau. One thing that's consistent amongst most departments is when you have conflicting statements in an official department interview, it's grounds for termination. I hear a lot of conflicting statements coming from the officer that was responsible for this. I'm a strong proponent for firearms control. However, when we have conflicting statements that resulted in, one of these statements, for example, is this officer made statements that exacerbated the situation as opposed to
Can I
bringing
tell
it
you
down.
who else made statements? The shooter, the actual officer that did end up shooting and killing Ronald Williams. Not a partner, but another responding officer. His name is Officer Ryan Kuzma. And the lawsuit that Stephen Mader has filed quotes some texts that he got from that friend on the force. Maybe not so much of a friend, though, it seems. Because this is what the lawsuit says. Officer Ryan Kuzma, the man who did the shooting, the officer who shot, sent Officer Mader a text message saying Mr. Mader was a coward and that Mr. Mader, quote, didn't have the balls to save his own life. He also said Mr. Mader and his mother were loud-mouthed pieces of shit who would get someone in law enforcement killed.
Highly inappropriate statements, and that officer should be punished as well.
But indicting statements?
Listen, this whole instance is outrageous. This officer should not have been fired at all. We're in an instance now where we talk constantly about police being about de-escalation. This was an officer who was there and made the assessment that he was not going to fire. It was the other officers who came on the scene who did fire. So what the police department is doing in order to justify the death, they're firing the officer who decided to preserve his life. We could talk about inconsistent statements. We have his attorney. His attorney said the statements were not inconsistent. We can talk about his past background and past experience. That's a ruse. And what the ruse is for is because he made a calculated judgment. And that judgment was to save that life and to use all the techniques he knew about interpersonal communication to make life-taking a last resort, not a first resort, as his brother officers did. Outrageous. He should be reinstated immediately.
Real quickly.
You're basing this on what the officer said.
I'm basing it on all
there.
the reports involved. None of us are there ever. Look, as a former prosecutor, I'm not there. I defend murderers. I'm not there. I base it upon the record. And the record, as we know, suggests that the officer who was being fired got onto that scene and he made the assessment that he was not going to shoot. And his brother officers came and started firing right away. And because he didn't fire, he gets fired. That's just not in keeping with good practice.
Although I will say,
these are
preservation of life.
statements
the
by the officer that failed to fire.
Preservation. That's what police need
I'm
to
a
be
strong
about.
proponent of firearms control, but this is a clear delineation of statements that weren't accurate.
I got a bigger question. The termination letter he got didn't just say you didn't shoot, so you're fired. It actually said things like you did illegal searches in a vehicle, you used profanity with citizens.
There was a historical timeline.
You have contaminated.
disciplinary
Hold
record.
on. You've contaminated a crime scene of a potential homicide investigation, and you failed to eliminate a threat in that shooting.
Excuses. Those are things that they say in order to justify the essential nature of the termination, which was for him not firing. Of course, it's analogous to the issues, and I won't get into it, involving the Comey termination.
Okay,
right?
the
It was about Clinton emails.
It was clear to me that the officer was on a disciplinary probationary track, and that's what happened. It happens in departments nationally,
Hey guys,
not just here.
Last word to Timothy O'Brien, attorney for Stephen Mader. You've been listening to this argument. You've been listening to this debate. What do you say?
What I say is this. On the night that this happened, Officer Mader was an officer in good standing. He was not on suspension. He had not been disciplined. It was only after this event occurred, within 2 weeks, that he was fired. It's very clear, and there are other documents that exist that show that the reason, the primary and determinative reason, was that he did not shoot this individual. And he had every reason not to. And he made the right decision according to what he saw at the time. When the other police arrived, the circumstances had changed. They fired. That shooting may be justified. But what my client did was the correct thing to do, and there's no basis, and it shouldn't happen, that somebody should be fired under those circumstances. Because here's the message that was...
It certainly is a different story. Normally the headline is the opposite. Someone's getting fired because they shot an African-American male who maybe did or didn't have a gun, and tonight it is the opposite. So I am fascinated by all of your points of view. I do have to cut it off there. But thank you so much. And Timothy O'Brien, I appreciate you coming on. I really want to see how this lawsuit prevails, so you'll have to keep us updated, okay?
Sure will.
And Darren
Thank
Porcher,
you.
thanks for your insight as well. Joey Jackson, you're not going anywhere.
Thank
we
you.
have a story tonight.
I appreciate it.
We have a story tonight. We absolutely could not make this up. We couldn't write it this good. or this weird. A man in Florida accused of choking his girlfriend to death, but he says he did not use his hands. You're going to have to go a little further south on this one. Yes, he now wants the judge in his case to let him show his business to the jury. He wants to show his anatomy in court to prove he didn't do it, his anatomy did. I'm not kidding.